All right. So tell me about Lewis Latimer. What is his claim to fame, so to speak?
Lewis Latimer was essential in the invention of both the telephone that was credited and patented by Alexander Graham Bell, and electric lighting and the light bulb that of course is credited to Thomas Edison. And he was also famous in his day. He was a polymath, a true Renaissance man, one of the greatest Americans in our history, though little remembered, coincidentally or not, because he was African American.
Thank you. Let's talk about your book, the Lewis Latimer, the First Hidden Figure. When I was reading the description, and if I get this correct, you were inspired because of the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you tell me why?
Yes. So, like tens of millions of Americans, or hopefully most Americans, I was angry, frustrated, and embarrassed for my country this spring, in the spring of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, and by the other violence that happened against African Americans. And so I felt like there was something I should do, that I could take it no more. And that's when I recalled that I knew a little about this guy, Lewis Latimer. I had seen a little of what he did. I had seen an exhibition. A friend of mine who used to be the executive vice president of the Edison Electric Institute, David Owens, had told me a little about him too. And so I started digging, and the more I researched, the more excited I became that he was such a great man that if I brought out his story and tried to draw lessons to today, that I could stir conversations and inspire people to talk about racial inequality today in a different way and in a stronger way.
What did you learn during your research about Lewis Latimer that made you go, wow, or awe?
There's so much. You're getting me started. Watch it. I'll just throw out about 3 things, but there's about 30 or 300 things. First of all, Lewis Latimer, his father was famous. The most famous African American in the early 1840s was George Latimer, the first well-publicized man who escaped slavery in the hold of a ship because he didn't want to be separated from his new wife and his expected child. And they escaped in the hold of a ship, made it to Baltimore. They pretended that he was the master and she was a slave. And they made it to Philadelphia and ultimately to Boston. And 4 days after George Latimer arrived in Boston, he was discovered by the head guy of his slave master, who just unluckily happened to be in Boston the same day. And so this slaver had George Latimer imprisoned, jailed by the sheriff of Boston on the charge that he had stolen himself, that George Latimer has stolen himself, since a slave is property. So that's one thing. So Lewis Latimer's father was famous, and ultimately the abolitionists saved George Latimer from being brought back to slavery.
What about Lewis Latimer, respectively, aside from his parents? What about him?
Yes, so he grew up clearly as he was one of the first students as a young child in integrated school, one of the best schools in Boston. It had just been integrated, the Phillips Academy. He had excelled, but in fifth grade, he was forced to leave school and go to work because of the Dred Scott decision, which forced his father to go into hiding. So he quickly started working. He found a job ultimately in a law firm, and they were working on patents. Latimer self-taught himself mechanical drawing, which was an essential art of the time, drawing inventions. And then he taught himself the law around patents. And then he taught himself how to be an inventor himself. He soon had his first invention, which was having to do with railroad cars. He ultimately taught himself electrical engineering. He ultimately taught himself Latin and Greek and French and German. He was the essential man who enabled Alexander Graham Bell to be credited with the telephone invention instead of Elisha Gray or Thomas Edison. He went to work with the company that was Edison's prime competitor and essentially came up with a better filament and a better way of manufacturing the light bulb.
Let's talk about that. Let's focus on the energy side of things, since I do represent the energy industry. You know, if it wasn't for his efforts with the filament, we would have not had a light bulb. Let's talk about that. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so Thomas Edison, of course, was competing and to be the first one and to be credited with the light bulb. And of course, in December of 1879, he did announce and demonstrate a light bulb and was credited with the patent just 3 months later. However, the Edison light bulb had two crucial flaws. One is the filament burned out after, depends on the account, 13 hours, 26 hours. It didn't last long enough. You'd have to keep changing light bulbs. And they were expensive, so lighting would only be for wealthy people. Secondly, the manufacturing of light bulbs was too expensive. And so again, lighting would only be for the rich. However, Latimer has patents on a better filament and a better way of manufacturing the filaments, which Edison quickly absconded with and put into use, as well as other competitors of Edison. And hence we have economical lighting for the world.
You know, let's focus on that slightly more. Think about this. We're talking about illuminating the world with light, allowing us to illuminate our minds. Latimer was a true Renaissance man, so to speak. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, no, incredibly so. So, I mean, don't get me started there too, because aside from the fact that he became one of the top technologists at the time, recognized by all the merchants of it, you know, the captains of industry, all white men, and enshrined as a founding member of the Edison Pioneers, the most elite club. But he was also widely respected by the Black intellectuals of the day who would meet in his home in Queens, the greatest poets, playwrights, musicians, singers, and novelists. They would meet with him. He self-taught himself the flute. His family all played music. He wrote plays. He came this close to being the first Black to produce his own moving picture. He would have been the first. He came close.
You know, let's go back to the filament, just because my story is so short. So
Yeah.
I want to make sure I can try to condense the answer a little bit. Do you mind if I ask you that again?
I know I'm going on too long.
No, not at all. It's absolutely wonderful. I'm constrained to time. That's
Yes.
all. You know how it is.
No problem.
Yeah. Let me ask you that again, and then if you can kind of condense it.
Okay. Yeah.
So tell me about how Lewis Latimer and his involvement with really constructing the light bulb.
Yeah. Thomas Edison announced and demonstrated a light bulb in December of 1879. However, it had two significant flaws that Edison recognized, and he was very concerned about this. Those two flaws: the filament would burn out only after a few hours, and the cost to manufacture the filament was also very expensive. So unless he could solve those problems, light bulbs would be too expensive and would only be for the rich. Who solved those problems? Latimer. He had a patent for each, for a longer lasting carbon filament and a cheaper way, a more efficient way to manufacture filaments for the light bulb.
Can you just tell us what a filament is?
Yes. So the filament is for those that can recall incandescent bulbs, it's the little thin wire that's in the middle of the bulb. And basically that's the electricity heats up that wire and it glows a pleasant kind of light.
Right. And nowadays, many of the retro light bulbs have that look. But that's essentially what people, how they could correlate the filament with, because it would heat up the inside of the light bulb, that little wire, correct?
Yes, yes. And just briefly, you might find interesting. So Edison's filament was like that. Latimer's bulb, his filament was like that, a little loop. However, Latimer's boss, Hiram Maxim, wanted to get the credit for Latimer's superior bulb. And so he had Latimer and his team shape the filament with an M instead of a single loop, so that it wouldn't be called the Latimer bulb, it would be called the Maxim bulb. M for Maxim.
Yeah, well, people always trying to get credit, right? Let's talk about his legacy. What is Latimer's legacy?
Latimer, along with his very good friend, Booker T. Washington, believed strongly that African Americans, just years after emancipation, needed to invest themselves so heavily in education and hard work in order to succeed in American majority white society. And Latimer was the paragon of that. No one had done that more. What he did, self-teaching himself constantly. He even laid out the Tuskegee University for Booker T. Washington. So he was constantly pushing the envelope to learn more, to hear more, and to contribute more to society. So that's one lesson.
No, I hear that, and I want to ask you.
Try again, no problem.
No. What is his legacy in the energy industry?
Oh, well, hold on. So his legacy in the electricity industry was that it is all driven from electric lighting. That's why we revere Thomas Edison. That's why worldwide, no matter where you go, people hear Edison and they recognize him as the person who fathered our industry. So it's so important to understand that Edison first competed with Lewis Latimer, the only African American there, that he absconded with the breakthroughs of Latimer, even sued Latimer at some point over patents. And as soon as Edison crushed Latimer in that suit, he immediately hired Latimer for Latimer to head basically the intellectual research and patenting of the Edison companies.
What was Latimer's actual profession? How would I refer to him as?
I think you'd have to say he was a polymath and a true Renaissance man. I mean, he started out as a impoverished African American in white society in the North, and he self-taught himself industrial drawing, patent law, law generally, electrical engineering, invention, international research, multiple languages. So what would you call Lewis Latimer? I don't know, genius, polymath, Renaissance man. I have said before, he's one of those people in American history I wish I could go back in a time machine and just spend an hour with him in his Queens home and just talk to that man.
Why don't we know more about him?
Yes, so that's such an important question because in his day, he was well known. And he had come to the point where the elite of American commerce and invention and technology, they all knew Lewis Latimer. They all did. And he was recognized as a member of the Edison pioneers. We have photos of him with Thomas Edison. So, and of course, he was well known by all the Black intellectuals, leaders, political and of all kinds. So why don't we know it? Because he wasn't celebrated through the years. Those years, he died in the late 1920s, and it was a long time, decades before it was in American society popular to talk about the heroism of our Black contributors.
When you turn on or off a light or see a light bulb, I'm just curious how it would be you to view a light source, considering what it is that you know and what you've looked up and studied. Do you look at it differently?
Because of Latimer?
Yes.
Oh, that's a good question. I look at it, I want to turn that question slightly, is that I think that as great as Lewis Latimer was, a genius, one of the greatest Americans in our history, how many more Lewis Latimers could we have had and did we not have? So that's what I think about. Imagine if there were 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 Lewis Latimers who had been able to get over the obstacles of bias throughout their lives and all the challenges that they had. And we could have had so many more of them. Think about how richer American society and our world would be. So that's what I think about.
Is there I want to go back to your book very quickly. I know we're getting close to time, but can you point out something in your book that you'd like to share? Something that stood out to you, something you really want to make sure that people get across, or something you'd like to tease?
Yeah. So I think that I don't know that it's fully in my book. There's some of it, of course. I have a section where I talk about where on the internet and even in scholarship and American university writings and so forth, over the years, there have been people that say and still say that Lewis Latimer and other Black inventors and great contributors shouldn't get any credit for what they did. So there's a lot, as you know, there's lots of bad people on the internet. And I actually call them out and critique what they say quite a bit. And I think that's so indicative, because what Latimer shows us, and those other hidden figures whose names we don't know, but we should know. They just never were able to get over the hump as Latimer was, is that all these allegations and ugly thought and things that people say about African Americans or other groups, about how they're, whatever lackings they supposedly have compared to white people, it's not only ugly, but it's self-defeating to our society. And so that's one thing that I think about.
Did he inspire you? Does he inspire you?
Oh, are you kidding? Wow. Like I said, if I could go back and time travel, who would you want to go see? Maybe I'd like to go, would Abraham Lincoln spend a few minutes with me in his office? Would Benjamin Franklin, could I talk to Benjamin Franklin? Could I spend some time at the Latimer home in Queens, New York? I wish. The guy was constantly trying to generate new ideas, trying to say, well, how can I further achieve? And it goes on and on. He never stopped. He was a machine. The guy was a machine. And he not only inspires me, and he should inspire everyone, but it would be so exciting to have some more of Lewis Latimer in our world.
We talked about this earlier, but I like to pick and choose shorter answers. So I'm going to ask you this again, point blank. Why did you write the book? Like tens of millions of people, Americans, I was angry and embarrassed for my country in the spring of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, and that further highlighted the other violence that we have in our society and bias against African Americans. And I felt that I have a platform as the editor-in-chief of Public Utilities Fortnightly. What can I do? Because I had to take a stand. I had to do something. As a white person in America who's fairly well off, I needed to do something. And that something was?
And started to investigate this great man and bring to light to him his greatness, just so that we can understand how an African American, with everything against him, achieved so much and gave us so much, and forced us to ask the question, how many more Latimers could we have had during the succeeding decades? And in today's society, how many more Latimers could we have?
Thank you. Any tidbit and we kind of talked about this again, any tidbit of information that you learned about him that you didn't know before? Something small, something curious, anything that you can share?
Yeah. So one of the things about Lewis Latimer is he moved seamlessly between the white world of, of, uh, of industry and technology and the African American world that was uh, trying to help the entire Black experience in America. He moved between those worlds. He was respected by both. I don't know how he did that psychologically, but it also shows that that lesson for today. We have, I have friends, we have people that we know in our industry that are great leaders of our industry. They also happen to be African American. And they also go between those two worlds. And sometimes that's maybe not that easy. So I don't know. In a way, this book is dedicated to my friends there.
What did you learn or take away from Lewis Latimer?
So Latimer constantly faced bias, and he overcame that. It was very tough. After all, he worked for Alexander Graham Bell, made Alexander Graham Bell a wealthy and famous man for all time. Alexander Graham Bell is one of the biggest racists of the 19th and 20th century. Ultimately, the president of the International Eugenics Society. So, but Latimer dealt with that. Latimer constantly dealt with and achieved over that. And I know a lot of people do that as well. He was amazing for doing that, overcoming bias and the hurt that can come with that, and still contributing and keep pushing through.
Thank you. That is it, unless there's something you like to add, something you like to emphasize, anything at all.
Just one more thing. It's one of the most famous things about him. So I'll try to, and I can tell that I'm not succinct enough. So in the early part of the 20th century, all of the Edison people and other great inventors of the time wanted to form an elite club, the most prestigious club, so that they could meet and talk about what they achieved and honor each other and be honored by society. And it was called the Edison Pioneers. And it started out with 30 some odd great men, most of them wealthy, all of them white, with the exception of Lewis Latimer. They couldn't leave him out. And when Latimer passed away, they wrote the most beautiful dedication to probably the only African American they knew, except as a servant. And when the New York Times wrote his obituary, they talked at length about how much Latimer had contributed to society. And I think intentionally never mentioned that Latimer was African American. I just think that was beautiful. And that's how I ended the book.
Oh, absolutely wonderful.